Imagine a place so grim and frightening that its very name can still send shivers down your spine. Nazi concentration camps. Now picture the men running these deadly institutions. Maybe you'd expect hardened soldiers or bitter old men, shaped and scarred by years of war. But in some camps, the reality was jarringly different. Many of the guards were barely more than children themselves, some not even old enough to vote, to marry, or to grow a proper beard. These were teenagers, young faces, some showing traces of boyhood, forced or enticed into the uniforms of the notorious SS. In the darkest corners of the Third Reich, these young men found themselves in positions of terrifying authority, ordered to oversee, punish, and sometimes even decide the fate of prisoners much older than themselves. It's a striking paradox when you think about it. Teenagers dealing with all the confusion and uncertainty that comes with growing up, but placed at the heart of one of history's most brutal systems. They walked the barbed wire perimeters, carried rifles, barked orders, and played an active part in the daily horrors of camp life. For many, their first job was not in a corner shop or as an apprentice, but as enforcers of a regime that thrived on cruelty and control. These were not seasoned Nazis from the earliest days of Hitler's rise. They were ordinary German youths, swept up, shaped, and sometimes broken by the forces of war and propaganda. To truly grasp how this came to be and what it meant for the prisoners and the guards themselves, we need to look not just at the camps, but at the world that created them. Nazi concentration camps were not isolated islands of evil. They were the logical endpoint of a system that valued obedience and ruthlessness, and which could see even the youngest faces as tools for its violent goals. In this story, we'll get inside the minds and lives of those young SS conscripts and ask, how did teenagers end up running Nazi prison camps? What did it mean for their lives, for the people under their watch? And what can we learn from their troubling legacy today? To understand how teenagers came to run one of history's most brutal camp systems, we first need to step back and see how these camps came into existence. In the early 1930s, as the Nazis grabbed power, their promises of carving out a new Germany were built on terror, suspicion, and the systematic elimination of so-called enemies of the state. That's where concentration camps first entered the story. These weren't originally built as death factories, but as places to isolate and break the will of anyone the regime saw as a threat: political opponents, dissenters, Jehovah's Witnesses, and eventually vast numbers of innocent men, women, and even children, simply for being Jewish, Roma, disabled, or different in any way. As the years went on and Hitler's grip tightened, the concentration camp system grew at a frightening speed, and its purpose shifted. What began as a way to control opposition quickly morphed into a central weapon for enforcing Nazi ideology. The camps didn't just punish, they deliberately terrorized, dehumanized, and ultimately murdered millions. And woven through all of this was the Hitler's elite paramilitary organization, which saw the camps as a testing ground for absolute control and cruelty. The SS didn't just run these camps. They designed them to break the human spirit, making them places where entire communities could vanish from a society in a matter of days. What's particularly chilling is how organized all of this became. The camps were not chaotic free-for-alls. There was a system, a cold, bureaucratic machinery fueled by endless paperwork, rules, schedules, and ranks. Every aspect of life inside was controlled from the top down. Guards and administrators, wearing the iconic black uniforms of the SS, were taught that compassion was weakness, and efficiency in brutality was a virtue. And as the Nazi war effort devoured more and more resources, the system grew more desperate for manpower, leading to the drafting of younger and younger recruits into service. So when we talk about Nazi concentration camps, we're not just talking about buildings surrounded by barbed wire. We're talking about a vast network designed to carry out some of the worst crimes in human history, driven by ideology, run with chilling efficiency, empowered by people, many of them frighteningly young, who were swept into this monstrous system. All of this set the stage for the unimaginable stories that emerged from within those fences, stories that, unbelievably, were sometimes overseen by guards barely old enough to be called adults. Now imagine for a moment what it must have been like to be just 16 or 17 and suddenly find yourself swept up in one of history's most brutal and infamous systems. As the war dragged on and the Nazi regime became increasingly desperate for manpower, they turned more and more to youth. In particular, the SS, the Schutzstaffel, which ran the concentration camps, lowered both the age and requirements for new recruits. Across Germany and occupied territories, teenage boys were targeted by aggressive recruitment campaigns, sometimes through outright conscription, sometimes through the seductive promise of adventure, honor, and a sense of loyalty to the fatherland. Many of these young recruits were still in high school, members of the Hitler Youth, or had barely finished their schooling. They brought with them not only their inexperience, but also a vulnerability to propaganda. From a young age, they had been taught to idolize the SS as an elite brotherhood, one that demanded total obedience above all. Once plucked from their homes or classrooms, the training these boys received was short, harsh, and designed to push them into a specific mold. Instead of being prepared for battle at the front, many of them were trained as guards for concentration camps. Their days kicked off at dawn with hours of drills, physical endurance exercises, and lectures that hammered in the SS ideology. Even this so-called training was less about developing real-world skills and far more about stripping away compassion, cultivating blind obedience, and preparing these teenagers to follow orders without question. The aim was clear: turn ordinary boys into efficient tools of the Nazi state. They were taught that discipline and loyalty to their superiors were the highest virtues, even above personal conscience or basic humanity. When their training ended, these young conscripts were posted to concentration camps scattered across Europe. It's chilling to realize just how young some of these guards truly were. Many were given authority over prisoners who might have been twice their age, sometimes even over children not much younger than themselves. As they took up their posts behind barbed wire and watchtowers, these teenagers were thrust into situations where they witnessed and sometimes participated in unspeakable cruelty. For many, this was their first real job. They were isolated from the outside world, overseen by older, more experienced SS leaders who set the tone and enforced discipline with brutality. It's important to understand, though, that not all these young guards became monsters overnight. Some were terrified, confused, and simply trying to survive in a violent, unforgiving system. Others, hardened by propaganda and their environment, adapted alarmingly quickly. The SS did everything possible to make sure peer pressure, fear, and the threat of punishment kept them loyal and compliant. Being a guard was as much about survival within the SS system as it was about maintaining control over prisoners. In the end, these teenagers, barely out of childhood themselves, became a crucial part of the concentration camp machinery, demonstrating just how far the Nazi regime was willing to go, placing the lives of thousands into the hands of the very young, trained to obey, and told that mercy had no place behind the camp fences. To really understand what it meant for a concentration camp to be run by teenagers, let's take a closer look at Stutthof, one of the very first camps established by the Nazis outside of Germany. Located near the Baltic Sea, Stutthof started off as a small camp, but over the years it grew into a vast complex that held more than 100,000 prisoners. What's truly striking about Stutthof wasn't just its size or the horror of its conditions. It was the makeup of the people tasked with keeping it running on a daily basis. By the later years of World War II, a large portion of the guards at Stutthof were shockingly young. Some were still in their teenage years, having been conscripted into the SS before they had even finished growing up. The Nazi regime was desperate for manpower as the war dragged on and losses mounted, so they pulled boys from schools and youth organizations, dressing them in crisp uniforms and giving them authority over life and death, virtually overnight. Inside Stutthof, these young SS conscripts were put in charge of almost every aspect of daily operations. Imagine being barely out of school and suddenly wielding power over hundreds, sometimes thousands, of frightened, starving prisoners. The camp was divided into sections: barracks crammed with men, women, and children, work details that sent prisoners to labor in brutal conditions, and guard towers where these young recruits stood watch. Many of these teenagers had received little more than weeks of basic training, focusing more on discipline and loyalty to the Nazi cause than any real moral judgment or life experience. The SS officers who ran the camp enforced a strict chain of command, but the guards themselves often relied on aggression and intimidation to keep control. For some, it became a place where insecurity and fear quickly transformed into cruelty. Witnesses recalled that many of Stutthof's youngest guards tried to prove themselves to older colleagues, becoming even more ruthless in the process. There were guards, barely 16 or 17, overseeing roll calls in the freezing cold, shouting at grown men and women, and carrying out beatings or, worse, when orders weren't followed. But not all of the young guards were hardened from the beginning. Some arrived at Stutthof frightened and uncertain, swept up in the momentum of war and propaganda. Yet the environment of the camp itself was designed to break down empathy and encourage conformity. Brutal orders came down from above, and refusing to carry them out could mean punishment or humiliation. For the prisoners of Stutthof, the age of their guards didn't mean mercy, it often meant unpredictability. Many survivors later remarked on the sheer youthfulness of their overseers, recalling faces that looked too young to belong to men with such deadly authority. In this strange reversal, teenagers who should have been worrying about school exams or their first jobs instead became cogs in a horrific system, making life or death decisions in a place filled with suffering. Using Stutthof as a lens, we see how Nazi desperation to fill its ranks led to the creation of a new chilling dynamic in concentration camps. Young conscripts, guided by a toxic blend of inexperience, indoctrination, and the relentless pressure to conform, took on roles that no child, or even most adults, should ever face. The result was a camp not just marked by the cruelty of the system, but by the tragic reality that some of its enforcers still had the voices and uncertainty of youth. It's a stark reminder of how the Nazi regime weaponized innocence, turning schoolboys into instruments of control, and forever blurring the lines between victim and perpetrator in one of history's darkest chapters. Now let's turn our attention to one of the most unusual and unsettling examples of Nazi concentration camps, Moringen. Unlike the infamous camps you might have heard about, like Auschwitz or Dachau, Moringen had a very specific and shocking purpose. It was set up by the Nazis in a small town in Lower Saxony, Germany, first used in 1933 mainly for men, but by 1940, it took on a sinister new role as one of the only concentration camps designed especially for young people. Imagine being a teenager torn away from your home, dropped behind barbed wire, and surrounded not by cold, faceless adults, but by guards hardly older than yourself. That was Moringen, a prison for boys and young men who, in many cases, were targeted simply for not fitting the strict Nazi idea of how young people should think or behave. The camp became a holding ground for so-called juvenile delinquents, some as young as 16 and sometimes even younger. These weren't always hardened criminals. Many were just ordinary teens, some caught listening to banned radio broadcasts, others accused of speaking out against the regime. Others landed here simply because the authorities considered their families undesirable. Life in Moringen was a strange reflection of the world outside. The prisoners had to endure harsh discipline, long days of forced labor, and constant surveillance. Yet, what made Moringen even more disturbing was that some of the SS guards assigned to oversee these young prisoners were themselves barely adults, sometimes only a few years older than those they guarded. Imagine the tension and confusion that must have filled the air. Teenagers forced to exert cruel authority over other teenagers, both groups trapped inside a system they didn't create. The young SS conscripts, plucked straight from youth organizations and quickly trained, or rather conditioned, by Nazi ideology, were given uniforms and the power now to enforce brutal rules. For some of these guards, wielding authority was intoxicating. For others, it was bewildering and traumatic. Their lack of maturity, life experience, and sometimes their own fear or insecurity often led to unpredictable, sometimes reckless behavior. There are accounts of guards acting with unnecessary violence, desperate to prove themselves to older SS officers. But there are also stories suggesting that not all could suppress their empathy completely. The lines between victim and perpetrator in Meringen were often blurred in a way that's hard to imagine today. Despite the overwhelming power imbalance, moments of tension and rebellion did break through. Some prisoners formed deep friendships as a survival mechanism, relying on each other for comfort and hope. Others found small ways to resist or assert some shred of dignity, but the constant anxiety was inescapable, as both prisoners and guards learned just how quickly innocence can disappear in a place built to crush the spirit. By looking at Meringen, we get a glimpse of how the Nazi system targeted youth, not only to punish and control them, but also to train the next generation of loyal followers. It's a chilling reminder that age offered no protection, either from victimhood or from being turned into instruments of the regime. Understanding Meringen, we can better see how the machinery of oppression didn't just operate at the hands of ruthless adults, but also through the confusion, fear, and ambition of young people trapped inside the nightmare of Nazi Germany. When the war finally ended, the world had to come to terms with the unimaginable crimes committed in Nazi prison camps, places where unimaginable cruelty was often carried out not by hardened men, but by young faces barely out of adolescence. The question of what to do with these former SS guards, especially the ones who had been teenagers at the time, became one of the most difficult and controversial issues in post-war justice. It's easy to imagine growing older and trying to leave behind a painful past, but for many people, the horrors they'd witnessed and survived demanded accountability, no matter how many years had passed or how old the offenders were when the crimes took place. One of the most revealing cases in recent history was that of Bruno D., a former SS guard at the Stutthof concentration camp. Bruno wasn't an officer or a mastermind behind Nazi policies. At the time he served as a camp guard, he was only 17 years old, still a teenager. Decades later, however, in 2019, German courts put him on trial for his role in the thousands of deaths that took place during his service. In court, Bruno was now an elderly man, frail and gray, but the shadow of his teenage self loomed over the proceedings. Prosecutors argued that even as a youth, he had contributed to the machinery of terror, standing guard on watchtowers, making escape impossible and enforcing rules that sent thousands to their deaths. Bruno's case pulled on the world's collective conscience, forcing us all to reckon with the idea of personal responsibility. Could a teenager shaped by the propaganda and pressures of the Nazi regime truly be held to the same standard as an adult? Or did the passage of time and the circumstances of youth offer any degree of excuse? The legal system had to walk a fine line, balancing justice for the victims against the idea that someone so young, so consumed by the tide of history around them, might not have fully understood the gravity of their actions. Testimonies from survivors and the families of victims, however, underscored the lasting pain caused by these camps, regardless of the guard's age. In the end, the courts found Bruno guilty of being an accessory to murder in thousands of cases. He received a suspended sentence, reflecting both his advanced age and the fact that he had been 17 and 18 years old at the time of his crimes. Bruno's trial set a precedent and reopened the debate about justice, memory, and accountability. It reminded us all that even teenagers, when given authority and indoctrinated with hate, can become part of a system responsible for terrible atrocities. And it showed that no matter how many years have gone by, the world does not simply forget. The legal and moral reckoning continues, as courts across Europe still deal with other similar cases. Each trial asks tough questions about complicity, intent, and the limits of forgiveness. For survivors, these proceedings are about more than punishment. They are a chance to tell the world what happened, to call out the truth, and to remind us all that even the young, when caught in the gears of evil, cannot escape the need for justice. So as we bring everything together, it really makes you stop and think just how complicated, how heartbreaking this chapter of history is. Throughout the story of these Nazi prison camps, from Stutthof to Meringen, we've seen teenagers in positions that none of us would ever want our own children, nephews, or neighbors to face. These were kids pulled from their homes, thrown into the terrifying machinery of the SS, and handed power over others that could, and so often did, lead to cruelty and tragedy. It's easy to feel horror and anger at what happened, but if we dig a little deeper, there's also a sense of sorrow for how ordinary young people were warped by the system they were caught in. The Nazi regime needed bodies to fill out its brutal vision, And in its desperation, it reached into the ranks of the young, twisting their sense of duty, pride, and belonging into tools of oppression. When you look at the post-war trials, like the one we discussed involving Bruno D., the moral questions get even more tangled. What do we do with someone who was just a teenager when they became part of something so terrible? Are they monsters, victims, or a painful mix of both? That's a question historians and courts have struggled with for decades, and it reminds us that history isn't always clear-cut. These stories force us to wrestle with uncomfortable truths, that monstrous systems can make monsters out of ordinary people, and sometimes out of those just starting to discover who they are. But there's also a lesson in all of this, and it's one we can't afford to forget. Societies have a responsibility to protect the young, not manipulate or corrupt them, especially in times of crisis. The experiences of these teenage guards show how dangerous it is when fear and ideology are allowed to overshadow empathy and moral responsibility. Remembering what happened in these camps isn't just about honoring the memory of the victims, which is so important. It's also about keeping watch over the choices we make as communities and how we shape the values of our youth. The past doesn't have to repeat itself, but only if we have the courage to face it honestly. By looking closely at these stories and not turning away from their darkness, we give ourselves and the next generation a chance to be better.